Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. We have a thrilling guest today, among top 5 fan favorites, I think it's fair to say. Not since Jefferson podcasted alone has there been a wiser man. Yuval Levin, he's the head of my shop at the American Enterprise Institute, author of many books, including his most recent, which really is a fantastic book, American Covenant. I keep wanting to say Compact. I keep getting it wrong, but I think I got it right. Which isn't just another book about the Constitution, although it is a book about the Constitution and its role, and I highly recommend it. And Yuval, welcome back to the Remnant.
Thanks so much for having me, Jonah. I appreciate it. I'm trying to imagine Jefferson doing a solo Remnant here, and it's not going well.
Yeah, I mean, he would probably say some strange things. All right, have too much sympathy for the Jacobins. All right, so many things to talk about. Just so for situational awareness for people, we are recording on the morning of Tuesday, March 25th. The bonkers Atlantic story broke last night. We can talk about that a little bit. I just want to be clear to everybody, I am not Jeffrey Goldberg, contrary to what lots and lots of people think on the Twitters. It's funny, I've gotten, every time I ever see Jeffrey Goldberg, it's not like we're close, but like we're cordial and friendly. And we've been joking for 15, 20 years about how we get each other's anti-Semitic email. And I, in fact, once picked up a prescription of his from my doctor's office. So so all the times not to be mistaken for Jeffrey Goldberg, it's really kind of tragic. But I want to get to a bunch of stuff, but Yuval, I figure it's got to be somewhat front of mind for you. What do you think of the whole thing?
Well, I mean, it's staggering from so many different angles. It's hard to know how to think about it. But look, I think the degree of irresponsibility involved in just having that conversation on a Signal chat is pretty amazing. That all of those people would have done that is astonishing. It's a funny thing. In a certain way, the actual content of the conversation was almost a little reassuring. It suggested that they have a structured decision process and that they're using principals and deputies meetings in a way that White Houses generally have. And I sort of thought, okay, well, that's good to know. There were interesting dynamics there of kind of who speaks up and who says what and who plays what role. But I mean, it's one of these things where you can think about the details in isolation and find them interesting. But when you step back from the whole thing, it's just astonishingly reckless and irresponsible. And I guess it also seems like maybe no one will pay a price for it. And even the National Security Advisor will just kind of move on. I do hope they move on from Signal and don't keep doing this. But who knows?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of punditry and analysis of all this at the Dispatch. We're trying to nail down a bunch of things. There are intense exchanges in our Slack channels. We figure out all this. So I don't want to waste it all. I don't want to waste this podcast on all that stuff because we'll get to a lot of it. But I will say, I think, first of all, the response from the administration, particularly after the NSA confirmed the authenticity of the thing, for Pete Hegseth to go out and say this is a hoax, really tells you just where their muscle memory is, right? It's like just shoot the messenger every time when in doubt. But I got to say, I think the classified stuff is bad. It is we're all going to get exhausted really quickly on the hypocrisy point about Hillary Clinton and her server and all that. I think you and I are perfectly comfortable to say both are bad.
Yes.
But I actually think the long-term consequences of this isn't really about the classified stuff at all. It's that I listened to The Economist's early take on this already. There's a lot of stuff in the European press. This confirmed that big chunks of this administration do in fact hate Europe and hate our allies and don't want to help our allies and have contempt for them. And that it's not just sort of Trump rally boob bait, but it's actually a deeply held conviction.
How they talk to each other.
Yeah, and that's going to have really long-term consequences because it confirms something that was still being debated in Europe in a way that you don't, it sort of settles that conversation.
Yeah, I've often had the experience that what you learn when you see things in person from the inside is actually just not very different from how they seem from the
Yeah.
outside. And in that respect, I think what we saw here is what you might have imagined a conversation among them would look like on that subject. And yeah, I think it's got to be horrifying, but not surprising anymore to some key allies of ours.
Okay. Let's get back to the stuff I wanted to talk about. Obviously, talking about Jeffrey Goldberg being randomly texted a high-level principals meeting was not something I planned on talking to you about when we put this on the calendar. So, in a much-discussed episode of Ezra Klein's podcast, you were on there, and I've written about it a couple times, referenced it, got a bunch of people at the Dispatch to listen to it because I thought it was very helpful for level setting early on. You kind of made the case, this was first 10 days, something like that, of the Trump administration, that, some of the stuff that people are freaking out about, they shouldn't freak out about, and that this will not last, that eventually Trump will not be driving the agenda. And I think that's still generally true, though he drives it still more than I think either of us would have predicted. Free to correct me on that. But when Klein asked you, okay, so what do you actually worry about? The thing that you came up with was Trump defying court orders.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we're there yet. We're getting closer to the line, but we're not there yet. But I am wondering, do you think we're getting closer to that? And what do you make of particularly the Boasberg Venezuelan gang member stuff? Are you troubled by the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act? And do you agree that the court should have should have the kind of deference to Trump in this circumstance that the administration claims they should?
Well, so I first of all, I agree with you that in a way the dominance, the energy, the momentum is still pretty intense to a degree that exceeds what I imagined at this point. Though we are still in early days, and I think it's worth seeing we're 2 months in. I actually looked yesterday at what things looked like 2 months into the Biden administration. What was in the press in March of 21. And actually, exactly 4 years ago today, it was the day that Axios published that piece about the historians coming in to help Joe Biden deal with the sheer grandeur of what he was achieving.
Oh, dear
The
God.
extraordinary achievement. That piece is really worth reading. It just argues, as a matter of fact, that we were living through the most transformative administration of our lifetimes, and that nothing would ever be the same. So I do think it's worth having a little bit of perspective on that front still, but obviously we are seeing big things being attempted. We are seeing a lot of energy here. And I do think a lot of what we're going to see will be about tensions between the presidency and the judiciary, in no small part because Congress has decided to sit out American government in this period. And that creates a vacuum that the president is rushing to fill and that the courts are therefore struggling to restrain him from filling. I don't think we've seen the administration defy a court order. I would say the big worry is, of course, about defying the Supreme Court, where there is no next step to take within the justice system, and we have not seen that. But it's not unimaginable that we will see that. I think the attitude of the administration suggests it's at least possible. One thing that we can take from the intense disputes we're seeing, and especially maybe the one about the flights to Venezuela, the flights of Venezuelan gang members, is that the administration is trying to set up confrontations in an Article 2 space. They're trying to pick issues that fall within the purview of the president's authority over foreign policy and defense policy and have the fights there. And I think that's something we're going to continue to see. I think that's why USAID has been so central to their otherwise domestic agency transformations. I think they want to have a fight over impoundment about USAID, where they can say this is actually a foreign policy agency and the president has the authority to decide what it should do and what it should look like. I think similarly, they're trying to treat the president's power over immigration as a kind of foreign policy power. They're pretending we're at war with this gang of this Venezuelan drug gang, and they're asserting that immigration is foreign policy. Actually, there was a little noticed kind of memo in the Federal Register from the Secretary of State about a week ago, 10 days ago, in which Marco Rubio asserted, under his power as the Secretary of State, that for purposes of the Administrative Procedures Act, the immigration policy was to be considered part of the foreign policy power of the United States, which creates an opening for the administration to take administrative regulatory actions on immigration without following the Administrative Procedures Act. I'm not sure that can ultimately survive in court, but it's a very interesting predicate to set for them to take steps that then will be challenged under the APA, and they'll say, actually, this is just part of the president's foreign policy power. That seems to be a planned out strategy here. Not everything they're doing is planned out. I don't think DOGE has been planned out at all. And I don't think all of the fights they're in are fights they wanted to be in or intended to be in. But what's going on here in the courts around immigration powers is intentional, is intended to broaden the scope of the president's freedom of action. And it's very important as a result of that. It's going to end up at the Supreme Court. I would expect that the court will restrain the administration some. And then the question is, does the administration accept that? And I think that, for anyone who's thinking, are we headed into a constitutional crisis? That's really, to me at least, the question to look to, and the place where they'll have to decide, the administration will have to decide if they really do want to break the boundaries and enter uncharted territory. We're not there yet, but it's disconcerting. And look, other things they've done. I mean, I think the intimidation of law firms is really beyond the bounds of, it's Wilsonian, right? It's not totally unprecedented, but where it's been precedented, it's been very bad. And I think in general, this has been so far a very Wilsonian administration. Their attitude about the nature of the presidency, their attitude about the way in which the president is the only truly democratically elected official. And if a judge says a president can't do this, do we really have a democracy? All that stuff comes from a very bad place in American history, and we're finding ourselves there more and more.
So I'm with you that the mandates are garbage. It's garbage concept. It's basically it's German romanticism as far as I'm concerned, right? But so this gets into a concert of things that I've been struggling with. So I described it in a G-File a couple of weeks ago as my complaint with the smart conservative approach to Trump. So I'm already excluding MAGA people and hyper partisans, right? I'm talking about our mutual friends at National Review, who I love and adore, or they're colleagues and friends and all of that kind of stuff. Or people like John Podhoretz, who's, again, dear friend. I'm recording a podcast with him later today. And for purposes of this conversation, you in the little disquisition you just gave, right? So these are people I respect enormously. I don't disagree with anything that they say within the four corners of their points, right? My problem is with taking each controversy as a standalone thing, right? So, and I want to be really clear. That is often defensible, and basically, and in this era of late night Japanese game show punditry, it is basically the only way to hold on to your sanity. Sometimes is just say, okay, let's be the dad. Say, so let's slow this down. Let's peel apart this giant. I used to tell my daughter, let's look at each of these problems individually, because when you add them all together, you freak out, right? That said, and I'm not treating you as my daughter in this hypothetical, but so let's take Donald Trump's decision to get rid of a whole bunch of top military officials, including the lawyers at the various branches. It is absolutely within his rights to do so, right? We have civilian control of military here, and the lefties who freaked out and somehow insinuated that Trump can't do this don't even realize what they're saying is that, okay, so you're saying that we basically have the Pakistani military now, right? The civilians cannot tell the military, you're out of here. So I agree that he can do this stuff. We can debate to one extent or another whether he should do this stuff, but there's a real lack of curiosity at times among smart conservatives with the why, because the why leads you to start talking about the forest and not talk about the trees. And so you mentioned the law firms, his approach to the law firms, his approach to the Pentagon, his approach to the Eric Adams prosecutors, right? You start looking around and at a lot of the Doge stuff and all that, you start looking around and you realize that this isn't about policy. It isn't about faithfully administrating the law. This is about creating, or it's possibly about creating sort of a patrimonial or personalist state. He does not, like, we can compare, you can compare him to Woodrow Wilson all we want, but there's a lot less Hegel and there's a lot more Don Corleone to this, right? Yeah. And so at what point do we say, okay, stop giving him here's the basic problem. And I know I'm rambling. The problem with looking at these things in isolation is you end up treating the president as an abstract academic category, like that, in a seminar, could the president do this in this hypothetical? And we can have an interesting conversation about that, a smart conversation about that. It leaves out the question of Trump's specific character and his specific motivations for retribution and all the rest, removing the Secret Service details for his political enemies, right? That is part and parcel of this larger fact pattern. And when we look at these things in isolation, we're sort of willfully blinding ourselves to the connected dots. And at least that's what I worry about. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I as I suggested about the signal conversation too, I think it's important to step back and see where these things fit. There's actually a danger of excessive abstraction in both cases. You can look at the individual cases and abstract from this moment and just think of them, as lawyers tend to do, about, is this technical step permissible? I'm not inclined to think that way, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't think that's the right way to think about this moment. It's also possible to step back so far into the context and make that abstract and think about presidential power as if it's a concrete thing, and the actual people being affected by these individual actions as if they're abstractions, when it's the other way around.
Right.
And I think that's what a lot of Trump defenders do. The way I think about this, it's not exactly, I guess I haven't thought about it in terms of a kind of mob mentality exactly, but I think that the Trump administration so far has been extremely reactive to its own experience in the first term. A lot of what they're doing is a response to lessons learned from the first time around. We're doing kind of a strange thing in that we had a president serve 4 years, and then he gets to sit out and stew for 4 years, and then he comes back. I think a lot of our recent presidents have spent their time after their presidency, especially if they only had one term, thinking about what went wrong. And the conclusion they come to very often is what went wrong is I was too restrained. I wasn't able to be myself in office. This is more true about Donald Trump than anybody else because he really doesn't have a conception of the presidency as an office anyway. And he left his first term with a lot of resentment about people who restrained him, who stood in his way, who acted as obstacles. And my way of understanding what's happening in this second time around is that almost everything he's doing is about liberating himself from constraints. And a lot of what the people around him are doing is about liberating the president from constraints. There are some people in his circle who learned a different lesson. The lesson they learned was we just weren't effective enough in working the system. I think you see that in immigration policy. You see that in some of what they're doing around DEI and civil rights laws, where they really kind of spent 4 years building out a strategy, and they're now operating very systematically through regulatory changes and guidance, and they're going to be effective in those places. But most of what they're doing is just trying to liberate the president from constraints. some people have this kind of pseudo constitutional theory about it, about, we're in a post constitutional moment and blah blah blah. The president, the that theory, I think, is not very deeply embedded in what the administration is actually doing. It's sometimes used as a way to make it sound higher than it is. What they're really doing is liberating the president from constraint. And so some of that looks like getting rid of the people who stood in his way last time. Some of those who are still around now are being fired. Some of those who, the kind of people who restrained him last time, the sort of traditional Republican experienced officials, are just not around. There's a much more intense loyalty test this time than last time. And it is really all about, will you let Trump be Trump? Some of it is about picking fights with the people who stood in his way last time in a new and different way, or they're acting out grudges against them. But a lot of it is just getting rid of constraints on presidential power. And the point of that is not that the American presidency is too weak, but that Donald Trump is too restrained. It's personal, and it's rooted in a sense that Trump should just be allowed to act out. And I think it's based on the supposition that where they failed last time is where he was too restrained. Now, I think, first of all, as a matter of fact, that is not true. Where they succeeded last time is where he was restrained by some people around him, by the lawyers who ignored him, by the markets, by Congress here and there, by the courts in many cases. They were able to adjust and take more effective action. The biggest obstacle to his success was his own character and personality, and that's still true. But nonetheless, that's their view. And I think a lot of what they're up to is about liberating him from various kinds of restraints that stand in the way of the power of the American presidency. And that worries me a lot, because those restraints are essential, first of all, when you have a president who is a person of as low a character as Donald Trump. They're also essential just generally, given the nature of the American presidency. And I think a lot of what they're doing is taking away the various mediating layers and just letting Trump act directly in an unmediated way, use the power of the government for his own personal goals, but also in his own personal ways. And in that sense, the danger in this second time around for Trump is much greater than the danger the first time. And I don't know that there's a kind of worked out, familialism or paternalism or all the various names that have been given to this. I'm not sure it's even that thought through. But I do think that it's about liberating him personally from constraints. And over, that seems to be the organizing principle of what they're up to. And obviously, it's a very dangerous principle to guide the actions of the American presidency.
So I agree with you that I don't think it's necessarily thought through. I think it is and I agree with you, the phrases patrimonial and personalist and sovereigntist and all these kinds of things, I think give Trump too much credit, and also they do a disservice because they are trying to impose these serious intellectual frameworks on a guy who, by his own testimony, rejects serious intellectual frameworks and goes with his instincts, right? And so I agree with you that it's not thought through, but so I've been wrestling with this thing. As you know, I am not a fan of nationalism. In small doses, I am, right? Poison is determined by the dose. Anything beyond sort of not Roger Scruton, British philosopher. Our friend passed away not too long ago. Gosh, what was his name?
Oakeshott?
No, not Oakeshott. That's too old. The last sort of great British.
Well, that is Scruton, right? Didn't you say Scruton?
Oh, it is Scruton. Okay, I'm sorry. I was getting confused. Okay, yeah. I got to stop with the day drinking. Okay, yeah. So Scruton. So anything beyond Scruton, I'm kind of skeptical of. But Nick Catoggio made this point a while back, shortly after the election, really, when Trump started talking about when Trump refused to rule out the use of force in taking Greenland.
Yeah.
Right. And when he started to make it really clear that he wasn't kidding about Canada, wanting Canada in the Panama Canal, and when he did his first linguistic conquest of his presidency with the Gulf of America stuff, and Conservatism made the point, which I felt really stupid, and that's not necessarily, I'm not sure I agree with him entirely on it, but I felt really stupid for it having not occurred to me, having spent so much time railing about nationalism, that nationalist movements, which again are not often thought through, they have thoughtful, defenders and rationalizers, but the actual nationalism itself is more of an emotive thing. Nationalist movements, whenever they get in power and have the ability, which is the key point, they start looking towards territorial expansion, because it's one of the only ways to sort of truly measure your greatness as a real metric is a Louisiana Purchase, an Alaska, a Crimea, or whatever. And again, I don't think it's that thought through, but I think Donald Trump thinks like a mob boss, thinks like a real estate guy, and you can explain to him why other presidents were great because they created this or they created that. He gets people who take over land. And was recently asked by Laura Ingraham, why are you so much meaner to Canada and our allies like Canada than you are to Russia? And he just flatly said, it's because they really have to be a state. They just don't, Canada doesn't work without being a state. They need to become a state. So I'm wondering, you're saying that the lack of restraints on the president is the goal in all of this. But what if, in Trump's mind, the lack of restraints on the president are the means to various goals, like Canada, Greenland, etc.? And are we as a country prepared for a president who has those kinds of goals?
Yeah, I mean, look, I obviously removing restraints at some level is always a means. He feels restrained from doing what he wants, and in that sense, I think we have to see that as pointing in some direction of what he wants. I guess I think that his desires of what to do with power are fairly disorganized. Even to call them nationalism strikes me as to pay them too high a compliment, whatever we think of nationalism. He certainly has a kind of urge to territorial expansion that is peculiar and is rooted in some sense in a kind of nationalist sentiment. It's not what he ran on. It wasn't nearly as prominent, I think, in the first term as it has strangely become this time around. But I think it has to be taken seriously because the guy's the president of the United States, and we certainly do have to ask ourselves: are we prepared for this? What are we doing in sending a delegation to Greenland with the vice president's wife? I mean, what are we doing? What is that? What are we doing in our relation to Canada at this point? I think that question really has to be asked, and it seems to me that people around Trump don't even really pretend that there's three-dimensional chess there most of the time. They're not even really trying to build out some grand theory around it. It's pretty clear from the distance we have that they think it's strange too, but that this time around you don't really push back in the inner circle when Trump does these things. I think you could see in that leaked conversation, or in that conversation that included Jeffrey Goldberg for no reason, that there's an assumed sense among his very inner circle that some things he says should just be ignored, or at least that he's not really on top of everything. I guess that's useful to see. But look, are we ready for these things? I mean, that's a question we really have to ask ourselves seriously in this moment, because the kinds of things that he just loosely talks about are not going to be nearly as mediated by restraining forces this time as they were last time. And so we have to take them more seriously, even more seriously.
I want to pivot a little bit. I started off with the courts and the Constitution stuff because I just wrote my LA Times column about this. But you preempted it a little bit by talking about Congress sitting on the sidelines. I have problems with the Trump argument for the Alien Enemies Act. But I will give him this. I think he sincerely believes that these people are an invasion, that they're super dangerous, and it's his job, blah, 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 blah. No man who saves his country breaks the law, all that kind of stuff. I think at a certain level, he believes that stuff. And at the same time, I don't blame courts to a certain extent. I mean, national injunctions are a problem, and this judge or that judge may have overstepped on this decision or that decision. But in a climate where the president is pushing the edge of the envelope on all sorts of fronts, and Congress is doing nothing, I want one of the checks and balances to like engage and say, hey, wait a second, this align with the law? Does it follow the Constitution? That seems reasonable to me. You and I both are, longstanding critics of Congress on this, and that Congress is the one who's supposed to have the real say in these things. Yeah. And so these people who are looking to impeach judges for getting in the way of the president, I didn't think I could have a new level of contempt for Congress than I do. But like, if you were going to say it is outrageous that these judges are exceeding their constitutional authority while refusing to exercise any of your constitutional authority, it seems to me like the outrage here is like Congress could actually write a law and say, this gang, we declare war on this gang, right? It could do all sorts of things that would make Trump's job in the courts easier. It's choosing not to do so because it just wants to opine about it and get credit for supporting the president without actually supporting the president in any meaningful way. I know you want to create something like a Federalist Society. We don't have to talk about Trump anymore, but like, I know you want to create some sort of like Federalist Society for Congress, right? To sort of replicate that progress that the Federalist Society made. How's that going? What does that look like in real life?
Yeah. Let me say a couple of things. I think part of the dynamic you're describing here is something that our colleague Adam White has really put his finger on, which is that there's a way in which the vacuum created by Congress has created a weird situation where each of the branches now is doing the job of one of the other branches without quite thinking it through. And Congress sees itself as something like a court at this point, as standing on the sidelines, waiting for things to happen and stepping in to provide oversight when they do. The president is viewed as something like a legislator now. We think the president's job is to advance a legislative agenda in accordance with the results of the last election. That's Congress's job. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the courts now are constantly asked to step in real time and take action immediately. Bring that plane back after it left. That's a little more like the president's job. And I Adam describes this really well. And I think that a lot of the reason why this has happened has to do with that enormous vacuum created by Congress. And so, yeah, part of my work and other colleagues of ours at AI is to try to help members and staff think differently about their role in the system. The analogy to the Federalist Society can only be partial, right? The Federalist Society had recourse to a profession in a way that they used really wisely and that they've used extremely effectively. There really isn't quite such a thing, but the reason the analogy speaks to me is that I think that we are, with relation to Congress now, kind of like where the right was in relation to the courts when the Federalist Society was created. And so if in 1981 you had said that you had listened to Antonin Scalia and Robert Bork saying, we're going to transform the judiciary into a body of originalist judges, you would have said, well, that's not going to happen. Right. Look at the courts now. Good luck with that. And of course, it took a very long time, but it did happen because they pursued an educational project directed at the people they wanted to move, and that then became an institutional reform project and came to be backed with real political power. I think something along those lines is necessary in Congress, where there has to be an educational project that is about what is really the role of this institution. And the target, the object of that project has to be to educate the people in the institution. You're actually trying to teach them. It's much more that than a kind of public education project. And the goal ultimately is to help them see why they should want to change the institution. I hope it doesn't have to take 40 years. There's a lot more turnover in Congress than there is in the judiciary. And so you can reach people and socialize ideas more quickly. But we're certainly at the beginning of any effort like that. And I think at this point, it is really at the stage of socializing ideas among members and staff. We do a lot of that. I spend a lot of time with staff on the Hill and with members, trying to talk to them about what the role of the institution ought to be and how to get there. I mean, I do think they confront very powerful incentives that drive them to behave the way they're behaving now. Incentives to prefer the political interest of their party and therefore of the president over their own institutional interest, and to think about their role in ways that are not very well connected to what Congress is supposed to do in our system. And I think to push back against that, you really have to help them see, first of all, that their lives don't have to be quite as bad as they are. Quality of life for members of Congress now is pretty low because they really are just circus performers, and most of them don't really want to be doing that, or at least some of them don't. But also to help them see that the only way this can change is if they want it to change. The structure of the institution, the nature of the budget process, the nature of the committee system can only change if members want it to change, and to help them see what that would look like and that it's even possible. You know, most members of Congress have only known this Congress. Most members of Congress weren't even there 10 years ago. And so they don't really have a different sense or vision of what the institution could be, or of how different it is now than the way in which it was intended to work and the way in which it often has worked. And so we think of this really as an educational project ultimately geared to institutional change. And, you know, how's it going? It's at an early phase, so it's hard to say, but there's an audience for this. There are people interested in hearing about it. Getting them to the place where they think they can do something about it, I think, is still ahead of us.
All right, so just continue on the Goldberg and Levin greatest hits front for one more round. You and I have written a lot about the way in which we have a tied political system, right? Where we don't have a sun and moon party. We have two moons or two suns, or really two moons, I guess. Although this last election feels like something gave way, right? Just the partisan drift to the right. But I'm looking at there's a lot of punditry out there. Everyone thinks that's their original insight in the last week or so, looking at these town halls to say the Democrats are having a Tea Party moment. By my count, 35 different talking heads have said it. And I'm not sure that's right. The social and economic forces that shape the Tea Party movement are just different than what we're seeing now, in my opinion. I could be wrong about that. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of energy, all that kind of stuff. What I'm interested in is, let's say that they're right, and that this is a left Tea Party kind of moment. Again, I think the left Tea Party was Occupy Wall Street, and that moment is gone, but let's sort of stipulate that it's enough like a Tea Party moment. That's not good news for people like you and me who think the problem has been with each party catering purely to its most passionate base and ignoring the median voter. And that's what this feels like a setup for a replay for. If the Tea Party analogy is remotely correct, and based on like the Bernie Sanders and AOC rallies in Denver this week and that kind of thing, then the lesson they're going to take from this is listen to the most passionate people who are saying fight, 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 resist, 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 Medicare for all that kind of stuff. And they're going to run on that, and they're going to sweep up enough of the median voters who are sick of 4 years of Trump to win. And then they're going to think they have a mandate to, again, do this very fringe stuff. And we're going to have another one of these examples, going back to your point about Biden listening to the historians, where these guys listen to what stuff they want to hear. They shoot for the moon, they overreach, and then the country throws that party out and puts another one in. I don't think we've ever been this. It's been this early that you can actually see the pattern reasserting itself. Do you think that's right? Do you think, is there a way to short circuit to that? You know, does the abundance Democrat thing, which I got my problems with, does that get us closer to one of these parties caring about the median voter?
Yeah, I think, first of all, that there is certainly a way in which this last election felt a little different, but it's worth seeing. This last election, the winner got 49.8% of the vote, and the loser got 48.3% of the vote. I mean, that's a 50-50 electorate.
Right.
And it wasn't obvious in the election returns that we've broken out of that deadlock dynamic. I do think that the political culture feels a little different in the wake of this last election than it did in the wake of the last few, and does feel a little less deadlocked. But I'm not sure what to make of that at this point, and it's not obvious to me that that we're not still stuck in that very same dynamic you described, because we are seeing the party that won 49.8% treating that as a massive victory and a huge mandate, and therefore leaning into what its activists want, and therefore turning people off. And Trump's approval rating is already almost 10 points below where it was on Inauguration Day. And so it may well be that we end up seeing kind of the same thing. I certainly don't think that energy at the base of the party's electorate is what will get us out of this dynamic. So a Tea Party moment is not what the Democrats need. The Tea Party, first of all, was rooted in a very long-standing kind of dynamic on the right that just I don't think is the same on the left, and it isn't going to look
I
the
agree.
same. But more than that, if the energy is people who say don't reach for the middle, which the Tea Party was in a sense, and which the Democrats activists are too, that's not going to get them out of this dynamic. I think the Tea Party moment solidified this deadlock dynamic. It's not a way to break out of it. It's how we got into it. And to reinforce that in the Democratic Party too, and they've done it themselves. I mean, they've let themselves be guided by their activists for a long time already. So I don't think that's what this needs to look like. I think ultimately what breaking out would require is a distinct kind of political talent that looks for a broader coalition and that thinks it's possible to achieve a broader coalition, whether in a presidential race or otherwise, by trying to take out some portion of the other party's coalition and bring it into your own. Trump has done some of this. I think that has to be acknowledged, though he's also lost just about as many voters as he's gained. And so the party has managed to stay at 50-50, even as their underlying coalitions have actually changed quite a bit. What it would take is a political talent capable of winning new friends while keeping the old friends. That has proven very difficult in the 21st century. I think it would take a kind of politician who is inclined to reassure the middle of the country. And we haven't seen that kind of politician in some time. I can see some governors who kind of look that way. And in general, the governors are the only sane people in American politics now. And so it seems to me that either party, if it's going to break out of this dynamic with a success, is going to probably end up doing that with a governor. And that person would have to have some capacity for recognizing what he sounds like to people who don't agree with him, who are not his party's activists, and some willingness to frustrate the activists a little bit in order to win other people, knowing that the activists aren't going to vote for the other party. That's just, as a general matter, what it takes to broaden coalitions in American political life. I guess I think there's a way that some of the abundance talk on the left might be closer to that than what we're seeing on the ground in the Democratic Party, just in the sense that it's an attempt to reach toward the median voter rather than to pull away from the median voter, which is what the Democratic Party has been doing otherwise. So maybe there's some promise in that. I have my troubles with it too. But it has a certain political logic to it. It has a certain policy logic to it. It's tied to 21st century challenges. I think that's a bit of what it would have to look like. On the right, it would need to look like taking some of what has been effective in winning new voters in the Trump era, but tying it to what was effective in appealing to the median voter before Trump. Trump's personality is off-putting to the median voter. There's no way around that. And the phase that follows this will have to disconnect itself from that kind of personality. I guess my instinct is that a lot of this would have to come from the political class in either party, that there's not really a way for this to be a bottom-up, grassroots-driven transformation, because the people who are engaged enough in politics to be at the grassroots of the two parties between elections are people who don't want to see compromise, who don't want to reach that median voter. And so it's going to have to be forced on the parties by politicians who want to win elections. And that's very often how this kind of change happens.
What do you think of the abundance argument, the Klein and Thompson one? I just had, partly on your recommendation, Mark Dunkelman on here, and I also had Yoni Appelbaum, and I find I have my disagreements, but I find their approach far more persuasive and fruitful. I think. I mean, in fairness, I have not read the whole abundance book yet. I've read a lot about it, and I highly recommend Kevin Williams's quite acerbic review of abundance. But there's as a good non-utopian conservative, whenever I hear the phrases like "scarcity is a choice," I cringe. And apparently, that's sort of there's a utopian flair to abundance that I don't think is a new approach. I think it's a very old approach. But like attacking red tape and zoning and improving mobility, these are very reformicon kind of ideas, and much more humble in their epistemology. So anyway, I wonder, what do you think of it all? And I think and what do you think of the fact that out of nowhere people are talking about abundance Democrats, and I haven't seen an actual abundance Democrat, right? It's just like they're talking about it as if it's the DLC or something, and yet it has no members as far as I can tell.
Well, this is another way in which it's a little bit like the Reformicons, and not in a good way. I think it's coming from people who are capable of ginning up a public conversation, but maybe not so capable of ginning up an actual political movement. And that is a frustration that I can recognize all too well, and that various attempts before Trump on the right to move the party in a more constructive and more populist direction did not succeed, because they were elite movements in that way and were not connected even really to politicians. I think there's some of that going on here. A lot of this, I think, is constructive and positive. It's self-criticism on the left, which has been badly needed, and it's critical of some of the things that ought to be criticized. And so I think it ought to be welcomed. There is a kind of neocon feel to it, or original neocon feel to it at some level. A sense of disillusionment with a certain kind of progressive utopianism as a practical matter. I think there's still a fair amount of illusionment about it when it comes to thinking about what they believe will be made possible by the pulling back of zoning and the empowerment of government. I think that the sentences they're starting are starting in the right way, but that the right endings to those sentences would have much more to do with the private economy than with the public sector than theirs do. And so we probably still disagree in the same way we have. And, it seems to me also that there is a healthy facet of it that has to do just with the sheer fact of focus on abundance. In a populist moment, there's a tendency to emphasize what we have too much of in American life. And so we say there are things we've got to get rid of. There are things we got to tear down. There's too many bureaucrats. There's too many immigrants. We tend not to focus on what we have too little of, which is actually where problems generally come from. And so we don't look at the things that are missing now. And we do this all the time, all over our thinking about politics. So we were just saying we're talking a lot about too much presidential power. We should see that this is a result of an absence of congressional power. I would think about the economy in a lot of the same ways. And thinking about what don't we have enough of? What do we need more of? Is a healthy way to start to think about contemporary problems in American life. But I guess when I think of what don't we have enough of, I incline more to think about family and community and religion and the private economy than I do about various kinds of more effective government agencies. That's a prejudice I have, and I think they're operating out of a prejudice they have to think in terms of what kind of government are we missing. I'm sure there's some truth to both of these, but ultimately, as I say, I find the early parts of what they write more persuasive than the later parts.
So that reminds me, I wanted to ask you about this offline since I talked to Yoni Appelbaum. Have you looked at his book, by the way?
Yes, it's a
Yeah.
wonderful book.
It's a great book. And so, one of the things I learned from you from Fractured Republic was about the period of massive institution formation, civil society institution formation in the late 19th century. And I thought of that when Yoni made this shockingly counterintuitive to me, point that those institutions, both the sort of the civil society ones, but also the sort of more standard, church, synagogue, Knights of Columbus, they all were formed and thrived in an era of extremely high mobility. And they're all dying in an era of low mobility. And his explanation seems pretty plausible to me that there's a natural, there are other things going on. And one of the things I like about his approach is he's perfectly willing to concede that social media is a problem. There are these other problems, but they're all made worse, or a lot of them are made worse by the lack of mobility. But, he says, look, it's just sort of a rule of thumb that institutions lose 10% of their members a year, some to death, some to this, some to that, whatever. What keeps them young and vibrant and makes them feel like they have a mission are new members. And when you don't have people moving, the only place that these institutions can go is down. They only atrophy. They don't get renewed by fresh tides, as it were. And I was just wondering, what did you make of that point? Because it had not occurred to me until he made it.
I think it's a persuasive point, but I would approach it a little differently. I think what was distinct about that moment and the civil society groups that emerged from it was that those groups served a purpose. Their purpose was not to bring people together and give them somewhere to go and build community, right? You can't really build that way. If you just have a meeting for the sake of having a meeting so we're all less lonely, no one's going to come, or at least no one who needs it is going to come.
Mm-hmm.
What a lot of those groups did was provide connections, networks, communities to people who, as he says, were new where they were, to people who were in an unstable place and in an unstable time. And they were built to solve discrete problems. And so they can't really survive when those problems are not what people perceive to be their challenges. And they can't really survive when those kinds of problems are solved in other ways by the market or by the state. And so I think in a way what he's saying is actually very similar to the kind of arguments that Robert Nisbet made about community from a somewhat different perspective, where the problem that Yoni thinks is being solved is the problem of, I'm new here, I don't know anybody, and so I got to get out of the house and get involved. I think that's true. That's part of the story, but that's not actually a different explanation than the one that says the problem to be solved is there's this immense transformation of the nature of life in America in the course of industrialization and urbanization, and so people just have needs that were not met in other ways, and they had to create new institutions, and they had to join, and they had to belong. And that in a period where you don't see as much dramatic breakdown and change, dramatic dynamism, whether that's by moving or whether that's by transformations of the economy, people are not responding to their needs by joining groups. Now, we have needs. We do live in a dynamic time, in a time of dramatic change. But I think people have ways of meeting those needs now that don't require communal work, or at least that we don't think require it. We can do it through the internet. We can do it by building these kinds of virtual communities that allow us to network, that allow us to, in a sense, know people. But what they're lacking is the actual reality of communion that is achievable by having an actual meeting for doing this. The internet has separated communication from communion in a way that we never really had to think about before. This really became especially obvious during COVID, where, I had the experience of teaching a class several times and just thinking, what's actually different here? Why does this suck so much, basically?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is we're still able to communicate information, but we're not together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that way of solving problems, that more contemporary way of solving problems, doesn't make for the emergence of civil society groups in the same way. I don't think that's disagreeing with Yoni exactly, but I guess I wouldn't say that just not moving is as much of a driving force as he points to. But I really recommend that book. I learned a huge amount from that book, and it's counterintuitive in all kinds of ways, where you think that's not how I understood that situation, and he
Mhm.
makes a very persuasive case over and over that the simple fact that we're not moving around as much is behind a lot more of our problems than we might imagine.
Yeah, no, I agree with you entirely. I mean, you know this probably better than I do because you're even more of a think tanker than I am. At least, you're a suit in a think tank. So, but there are people who, when they specialize, when they're a silo scholar, they start to think that their issue is the key
Yeah.
to everything. I mean, I remember 30 years ago, I'll keep his name out of it, but there was a scholar at AEI who was had this unbelievably, you can probably guess who it was, but unbelievably convoluted theory about how the Soviet Union fell because of stuff that was happening in Nicaragua. And it's because he cared a lot about what was happening in Nicaragua. Anyway, all right, I'm going to cheat a little bit. I've been laboring over this piece that I agreed to write for the Dispatch about whether or not the right wing is conservative anymore. And I think you know as well as I do that this is fraught in part because you start getting bogged down in really annoying label stuff. Right? What do you mean by right wing? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? And at the same time, I think, I mean, I'll leave it for my piece to define the terms as much as I think necessary. But if you can detach from the terms to a certain extent, or just sort of stipulate to their meaning, I think it is fair to say if you take the term conservative seriously, it is the opposite of radical. Right. This is not my point. This is an Oakeshott. This is a Burke. This is a Sam Huntington point. This is a very Yuval Levin point. Right. Is that there is, and it doesn't have to just be the dispositional conservatism to say is the opposite of radicalism, because the whole point of conservative ideology is to say slow your roll. Radicalism is a bad instinct, but that doesn't mean that there isn't that there aren't radicals on the right. And the problem is we get into this thing where, once you start looking for it, it's in every write-up of everything about the American right, the Republican Party, is we use conservative and right wing as interchangeable terms. Conservatives in Congress want to do this. Right wingers want to do that. And sometimes just in the same way that, like, I hate using the phrase the Jewish state to describe Israel, but just for a little variety, you want to use a different synonym. You end up using the Jewish state just to make it not the same repetition. And I think linguistically, that's a real problem, or that's a real phenomenon with right wing and conservative. But you look at you mentioned earlier Elon Musk and Doge. Every argument in the world to say that's a lot of that stuff is right wing. You have to be a lot more selective to say that some of it is conservative. Yeah. In part because they're just Chesterton's fences all over the place. He doesn't know why these things are there. And when in doubt, he says, tear it down. And that can be right wing, to be sure. It's very hard to make a case that that's conservative in either the ideological or the temperamental case. So I'm just wondering, since this way I don't have to bother you in the hallway, what do you think about all of this? How do you think about all of this?
Let me suggest a rule of thumb about the right. So I think here of the work of my friend Arnold Klein, who wrote a wonderful book maybe 15 years ago now called The Three Languages of Politics, in which he suggests that one way to think about left and right, to the extent that those are useful, and I think they are, is that the right thinks about the world in terms of order versus chaos, or civilization versus barbarism. The left thinks about the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And that difference is actually very long-standing in the West. I think it goes back at least to the Age of Revolutions. And it's very helpful. It doesn't describe everything, but it's very helpful. Not everybody who thinks about the world in terms of civilization and barbarism is conservative. I think that's one way to react to that distinction. There's another way to react to it, which is a more radical defense of civilization against barbarism. I think a lot of what we're seeing on the right today is very much in line with thinking of the right as shaped by a distinction between civilization and barbarism. If you listen to Donald Trump talk about immigration, that's exactly what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
Or talk about crime, or in general talk about the left. And a lot of the people around him, too, talk in the same way. You and I lived through a long period where the dominant camp of the right was the conservative camp. And so it was possible to think about the right as conservative almost interchangeably. Not quite. There were always very unconservative voices on the right, but they tended to be smaller factions who were basically complaining about the direction of the American right from the right.
Right. They're marginalized.
Yeah. And something that's happened in the 21st century is that the populist right, which is not inherently conservative, has become the dominant faction on the right. And that means that to say the right now, I think it's still very helped by thinking about the right as defined by this distinction between civilization and barbarism, trying to maintain order in the face of forces of chaos. That's still a lot of what that populism is trying to do. But it isn't rooted in the same assumptions about human nature and the nature of social order and the difficulty of building institutions and sustaining them and the importance of tradition that are the conservative tradition, the essence of the conservative tradition, articulated best by Burke and in various ways by others since him. That's a right-wing view, but it's one right-wing view. It's my view, and I think that it's probably most naturally and effectively at home as the dominant voice on the right, but it's not always the dominant voice on the right. And we're now in a moment where it's just not the dominant voice on the right. And a lot of the forces around Trump, but you see this in other parts of the world too, that are identifiably right wing, are not always identifiably conservative. And so I think there's more of a difference now than there's tended to be. But nonetheless, that right and left are important and very meaningful categories, and that conservatism is naturally at home on the right, not coincidentally, but conceptually, it's at home on the right. There's a link between those non-conservative forms of being on the right and conservatism. They are related around an idea of human nature that does value social order and that therefore does assume that barbarism is the threat we face more than oppression. That's the great danger that politics has to combat against. And so I think the right is at its best when it's conservative, but it's not always at its best, and it's not at its best today.
That's helpful. It's interesting. I got quibbles, but we're going over an hour, and I don't want to abuse the privilege. But I would make a brief, just at least a little bit, for the idea that there is a kind of conservatism that can be on the left of center, right? And
sure,
I think that one of the reasons why we are so frustrated with politics today is that kind of left of center conservatism, or the more proper word would just simply be reasonableness, is as drowned out as the sort of right of center reasonableness is drowned out, maybe in different ways.
Yeah.
But like,
I think that's right, Jonah. But let me say one more word about this. I think that I think conservatism is more naturally on the right for a reason. That it begins from an assumption about human nature, that we're fallen, that we're prone to disorder.
The first barbarism is us.
Yeah, and therefore, what's necessary, what we need from politics, is is formation toward the capacity for social order. And therefore, the institutions that do that well need to be preserved because they're not natural. They're social achievements. They've been built up over time. We have to protect them. That suggests that the danger to combat in political life is barbarism, is chaos, is a descent back to the natural disorder that is human existence. The other view of human nature that says we're actually born free, and the problem we have is that all kinds of powerful people don't want us to be free, naturally points in the direction of a politics that sees oppression as the core problem to be solved. So that there is actually a logic to the conservative disposition being found more often on the right than on the left. It's not that there are no conservatives on the left, but I think that it's much more coherent for the conservative worldview to find its home on the right, even though it's never going to simply define the right.
No, I think that's fair. But I think your point about, institutions that equip us to deal with barbarism, there's a very strong case that, I don't know, Al Shanker, Diane Ravitch, right? These kinds of left of center, Nat Glazer, right? Was always still a Democrat, who cared a lot about schools. In fact, cared a lot more about schools than most conservatives did for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
Saw the job of, the reasonable reformist agenda of making schools good at forming character. That mission was much more at home left of center.
Yeah.
And it's still a very, in the way you're using it, a conservative one. The problem is that, and I think you're absolutely right. It goes back to the, Locke versus Rousseau, or Smith versus Rousseau, however you want to do it, is basically almost all public policy arguments. And, but so I agree with you entirely that the further you move left, the more you move towards this man is born free, yet is everywhere in chains, Rousseauian, utopian nonsense. But the more you move to I'll back up. I see much more, as you know, I was a critic of horseshoe theory for most of my professional career. I just thought it was something of a slander, that if you look at the pillars of American or Anglo-American conservatism, certainly since World War II, it's basically, two, I would argue two, but you can say three things. It's sort of the Cold War part of it. But then it's classical liberalism, free markets, free minds, individualism, limited government, the principles of the Constitution. And then it's cultural traditionalism, family values, wisdom of the ancient, all that kind of stuff. And in no way, the more you embrace those, do you get closer to the left. But the second you start taking the liberalism out of right and left, horseshoe theory works just fine because it's illiberalism, and there is right-wing illiberalism and there's left-wing illiberalism, but where they meet, where, as the Marxists would say, the praxis of where it actually gets put into policy, it's really just different flavors of the same approach. And so the only point I was trying to get at is that I think there's a left of center, quote unquote, conservatism, that if it were more robust, it would make the right of center conservatism more robust.
Yeah.
The problem is that both keys haven't been turned. And so, like, even though you and I can have a better conversation with Jonathan Rauch, who's probably the most conservative liberal there is, more than we can with, Benny Johnson or something, or Candace Owens, the people who talk like us, or more like you and Jonathan, they don't have the broad appeal that Dan Bongino does, who I don't think, that the podcast right wingers are not conservative, but they are right wing.
Yeah.
And you can see, there's no place better to illuminate horseshoe theory than the socialism of fools that is anti-Semitism. And you can just see the right-wing anti-Semites and the left-wing anti-Semites. They're like both circling each other at a party, not realizing they were both invited. And you're like, wait a second, do we belong here with you? And they're realizing that they do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And obviously, right and left are explanatory tools. They're not natural phenomena. And the terms themselves, sort of come from the left and have their own problems. I think they're useful explanatory tools, but there's no question that in a moment like this one, you see a lot of ways in which they're much more permeable than this. I think anti-Semitism is an example of that, but you can look at Robert Kennedy Jr. and a certain kind of health nuttery, which has always been a bridge between a certain kind of right and a certain kind of left. And as you say, there are also related bridges between a more classically liberal right and a more classically liberal left. Classical liberalism is under siege in our politics now, and so both the left form of it and the right form of it kind of feel like they're not really in charge of their political coalitions. But yeah, I think those connections are helpful to see, and they matter. It is also worth seeing the way in which conservatism is both a disposition and a set of ideas about the nature of the human person, and they're deeply related, but they're not entirely the same.
Yeah, I've now written probably 8,000 words for a 2,500 word essay on this, and I've been going through all this stuff. I agree with you that there is I think Russell Kirk had many fine qualities and made many wonderful contributions. He was just wrong at this idea that that conservatism is a negation of ideology.
Yes,
and
I agree with that.
that you cannot reconcile conservative ideology with temperamental conservative. He's just flatly
I think you would
wrong.
have to define ideology in a way that is intended to prove that point in order for it to be true. But
it becomes a no true Scotsman problem.
Yeah.
It's like all ideologues are not conservative, therefore ideological conservatism isn't a thing, and that's just not a persuasive argument. But anyway, so I'll give you the last word on this. Do you foresee a time when forget right versus conservative, when the populist faction of the right-wing coalition is no longer in the driver's seat? I think it'll happen eventually, but do you think it'll happen before you and I retire?
Yeah, I think that there's a way in which populism tends to get digested by the parties in our politics and come to function as a faction within a broader coalition. And so I think it's a matter of seeing our parties find their way toward building broader coalitions. And within those, there's always going to be a place for populism, as there always has been. But there can also be a place for a broader kind of appeal that in America almost has to be rooted in classical liberalism in order to be broad enough to build a majority coalition. The fact is, populism doesn't represent enough of the public to actually be popular enough to form a broad coalition. I think we've learned that over and over. We're learning it now. However much we persuade ourselves that whatever the last election result was this huge mandate, it just wasn't. And the failure to build a huge mandate is a failure to appeal to the underlying fundamental classical liberalism of the American public. It'll take a certain kind of political talent now to break through that and make that sort of appeal. And that person will speak to populist inclinations. It is that kind of moment, a moment of suspicion of elite authority, which is what populism is. But you respond to that by building a more reliable set of elites, and that takes time. But it's sort of the work our politics does, and I do think it's going to happen. Populist periods don't last forever, at least so far, and I'm conservative enough to think that the basic rules haven't changed. So I do think it'll happen. But it won't happen by itself. It's got to be built. And, people like us can play some small part in trying to do that. But ultimately, it'll take people who are capable of moving the public in the political system. And I'm looking for them.
All right, Yuval Levin. Last question. Michael Strain, it's all off the record at World Forum, but I think this does not break any of those rules. The announcer for one of the sessions kept pronouncing your name Levin, and then someone else was doing Levin, and Strain turned to me and was like, "Wait a second, isn't it Levin? Is it Levin? Where is the
This is the story of my life.
Where do you come down on this pressing issue?
I have lived a life that has made me very tolerant of this problem, but the way my family pronounces it is Levin. The second syllable is stressed. That's just the Israeli way of doing this, and there are a lot of people who spell their name the same way I do and say Levin. and it's okay for them to be wrong, but they are wrong.
Okay, so as the French would say of the bottle of wine,
Right.
Levin. Levin.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Like Mark Levin.
There you go.
All right. I saved the best question for last. So there you go. Yuval Levin, thank you very much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Jonah.